We're now going to launch into our second panel discussion of the day, and the topic is going to be current challenges with financing and the implementation of infrastructure projects in the Arctic. We're going to approach this from three different angles: the private sector, the public sector, and of course the view from the scientific community. So let's get our panelists up here. First up, representing the private sector, we have Sven Hardenberg. Sven is the founder and chairman of Greenland Invest. Come on up here, Sven, and take a seat. Weighing in on the scientific view, Paul Arthur Berkman. Paul is a professor of practice in science diplomacy at Tufts University and also the University of California, Santa Barbara, a research professor at the Marine Science Institute. And of course, he's going to be giving us a science/policy view. Come on up here, Paul. And finally, representing geopolitics, a crucial consideration here, Ambassador Tormod Endresen. He is the Norwegian ambassador to Singapore. Let's give the ambassador a round of applause as well. Your microphones are on the tables in front of you. We would really appreciate questions from the audience, as this is a dialogue and we'd like to get your input and your concerns put to our panelists today. So a little bit later on, I will be opening this up to the floor. And if you have a question, just put up your hand and we'll get a microphone over to you so you can direct your questions up here to the stage. Before we get started, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to give a little 2-minute summary of what they are seeing from their perspective when it comes to development in the Arctic. And Ambassador, since you're sitting next to me, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank also the Arctic Circle and the SMI and President Grimson for facilitating this very important discussion. I had a feeling the last sessions that we're onto something really important. And obviously also it has become clear to all of us that the Arctic region is in need of investment. The question is, of course, how should we go about investment in this very vulnerable and special region? And I think representing an Arctic state, in a way the most important deliverable the Arctic states can provide is a continued, stable, and predictable order in the Arctic region. That's what we have, and that's what we will maintain going forward. I think that's sort of the number one condition for any investment. And then I would also like to commend the private sector, Guggenheim, and other good people at the WEF for looking into an investment protocol for this area. I think that's important. Like in any other part of the world, socially responsible investments is becoming a trend. That comes, of course, on top and above national regulations that are in place in most of the Arctic states.
So a lot of responsibility as we move forward. Sven.
Yes, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be a part of this forum and to give you some of my insights. One of the items that I really want to underline is that infrastructure projects are present in Greenland. And it's very interesting to put forward, because our government has a plan now to develop 5 new airports. And the first one will start its construction phase in 2016. That will be next year. So we're really looking forward to that. So in regards to infrastructure projects, the projects are liable and relevant, and the projects are very sound and make sense. So we would like to give that out to you, so you can share that with everybody. And yes, that's the main issue that I wanted to stress.
Okay,
the projects are there.
Safe place to invest and to explore opportunities. Okay, for the scientific view, Paul.
I'd also like to thank President Grimson and Alice Rogoff and the Arctic Circle for convening this discussion, as well as Singapore for hosting this session. If we take perspective about what's going on in the Arctic Ocean, consider this room. We've got a floor, we've got walls, we've got a ceiling, we've got inflow and outflow through the doors. If we remove the ceiling to this room and suddenly we're exposed to the wind and the rain, cold, the hot, our dynamics in this room would fundamentally change. In effect, the Arctic Ocean today is 50% open water during the summer, more than, and more than 50% is first-year sea ice during the winter. In effect, the ceiling to the Arctic Ocean is changed. If you change the boundary condition of a room, it's a new room. In effect, because the Arctic Ocean is exposed to a new room, it's exposed to inherent risks of political, economic, and cultural instability. This happens during our watch as a generation. We have great responsibility to think forward in terms of planning to prevent changes that are irreversible, that impact the lives of the indigenous communities, that are unsustainable. And that is part of the challenge in terms of what's going on in the Arctic Ocean today.
Thanks to all three of you for those opening comments. Why don't we start by discussing the Arctic Investment Protocol. It's not legally binding, but it is a code of conduct. Will this change the way, in your opinions, that investment is done in the Arctic from this once it's tabled? What happens from this point on?
Well, in regards to the Arctic Investment Protocol, I think it's really relevant to put it forward because for the last 3 or 4 years we have tried to put forward the agenda of the need for international capital to be formed in regards to targeting investments in the Arctic. And now there has been some sustainable focus on developing such a stewardship in regards to a protocol, and that helps a lot in regards to refocus the world's eyes in regards to the possibilities in the Arctic. So we are welcoming the protocol, and I think it's really, really relevant.
Yeah, provide some great guidelines. Ambassador.
Well, in terms of the substance of the protocol, it ticks at least 3 important boxes for me. It talks about people in the Arctic that need to take them into consideration, use them as a resource, take them into account, and then secondly, the environment, which is of course very important, and then thirdly, knowledge and science. I think it can't be overestimated how much it means that we base everything we do in the Arctic on existing knowledge and on scientific findings.
Professor, what do you think from an environmental perspective? Will this provide some guidelines and help protect the environment?
I think the expression in the protocol seeks balance. So there are a number of things that are being balanced: economic prosperity, environmental protection, societal well-being, but also there are needs of the urgencies of today as well as needs of future generations. And I would suggest, importantly, the protocol provides a vehicle for balancing national interests and common interests and an expression of inclusion. Meeting here in Singapore is certainly an expression of inclusion in the Arctic states reaching out to non-Arctic states.
That's a great point. I was a bit surprised when they asked me to moderate at an Arctic Circle panel that's being held in Singapore. How does Singapore factor into this? What's your take? Why is it important in the development of the Arctic and non-Arctic countries?
You know, Singapore has everything to offer the Arctic, I would say. To make only 3 points, I mean, they have a phenomenal maritime competence in terms of technology, in terms of being a big flag state, in terms of being a big port state, indeed the second largest port in the world. So that is a very strong asset in the Arctic. Then they have governance experience, which is very valuable. And thirdly, I think they are also having and bringing to the Arctic Council a sort of geopolitical, strategic insight that is very useful.
Sven, give us the investment perspective on this. Where are the best opportunities?
Well, as I said before, at least in our country, there's a lot of projects in the infrastructure area. So there's obviously the most potent projects right now because, as I said before, the first project will start up next year. But may I add, the Arctic Investment Protocol helps the Greenland government and Greenland interests in putting forward some of the issues that foreign entities has to bear in mind when they approach us for seeking opportunities, because it underlines some of the most important items for us when we are looking from the Arctic and outwards, and that's the sustainability issue. Obviously, we live there. I've been born and raised in Greenland, and I hopefully will die there, and my children will also live there. And our focus on sustainability is a way of life for us. So when we are putting out projects for entities to approach and invest in, it can be difficult to have a dialogue because we have another mindset per se in that regard. And the Arctic Investment Protocols helps us when we are starting up a dialogue, because it sets a framework on how to approach different opportunities in our country.
But Greenland, it is receptive
Yeah.
to external investment and cooperation. You would agree. Okay, Professor, do you think that it's realistic to expect that we can go in and develop infrastructure in the economy in the Arctic and do it without really harming the environment? You do think this is possible?
Again, I would come back to the challenge of balance. I think Anna's setting expectations correctly. For example, governments set contingency plans for oil company operations. And consistently, the contingency plans are exceeded, and there's something that happens that wasn't anticipated. I think the expectation is that with development, there will be mistakes, and the mistakes hopefully will be mitigated by thoughtful infrastructure in the process. But this is an iterative process, and I would, as a suggestion, go back to a meeting in 1903 that was held in Philadelphia. It was an international and national roads convention. And they identified that cars and trucks were being built, and they were bumping along roads through potholes. And out of that came an understanding that they needed to construct paved roads across the coming decades. And that's where we are in the Arctic. We're at the crossroads of looking at potential investment in development and thinking about how to properly pave those roads in terms of what the Arctic will look like over the coming decades.
And what about paving the oceans? I mean, shipping is such a big consideration for the audience here in Singapore. What happens if you're shipping and there's an emergency? Is the emergency response that's in place right now, is it adequate? Is that an opportunity, a place that we need to focus on?
I would say emergency response anticipates rather than responds. I would say that emergency response anticipates rather than responds. So there is an opportunity to look where the potential activity would occur. I mean, for example, in the Chukchi Sea, we have activity going through potentially from the Northern Sea Route, the Northwest Passage, across the Transpolar Route, in and out of the Bering Strait.
And we actually have a slide showing this, correct? If we could pull up the slide. And continue, please.
So we have open water today north of the Chukchi Sea. So this is a picture of the sea ice extent taken in 2012, which was the sea ice minimum. And we can see that all of these potential trade routes come through this region, going in and out of the Bering Strait. I've been at several meetings on St. Lawrence Island, which is near the bottom point, the bottom of the Bering Strait. And the indigenous communities are very concerned about the potential traffic, about the likelihood of an accident. And there is an opportunity to imagine an emergency response platform that could sit in the Chukchi Sea that would be responsive to accidents in the Russian waters, in the U.S. waters, in the Canadian waters, that we would responsive 1,000 miles north of the Aleutian Islands, considering environmental protection, but also responding to services that would occur through the Arctic Ocean.
Who should take the lead on this? Any opinions up here on the panel? Any country? Should it be the United States? Should it be anyone?
I think it's difficult to say. There's been other panelists up here already elaborating on that, so I'm not a shipping person or anything in that regard, so I'll be reluctant in giving my views on that one.
Ambassador?
Well, for search and rescue capabilities, you mean? Certainly the coastal states in the Arctic will have to play a lead role, and there's work going on in the Arctic Council in this regard. I think we all realize that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but that's the point of departure, I think.
All right. What about collaboration between the public sector and the private sector? How do you see that unfolding in the Arctic?
Well, I think we had a good demonstration of that just now, that, of course, we need states, we need business, we need NGOs, we need indigenous people. We all need to work together in the Arctic, and we have a unique chance to build a system of governance that take all of these factors into account.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is in a way already happening. I think it's very positive. I think indeed what we've heard about the investment protocol is a sign that we share a strong sense of responsibility that sort of everyone that comes into contact with this area is reminded of when they see the vast opportunities, but also, like has been said many times, the big responsibility that comes with doing anything in the Arctic.
Absolutely. Sven, when we were chatting earlier, you said that for some investors there's a sense of insecurity when it comes to investing in the Arctic. What did you mean by that?
I think the global knowledge about Greenland as a country and of course also an area to invest in is limited in regards to the knowledge. People have a tendency to look at it as like a black box and are reluctant to go into the area and put up all sorts of challenges in that regard. But very few actually know that private-public partnerships has been existing in our country since the mid-80s, when we started to develop our energy sector with building up the first hydropower plant. And that was quite successful, and there has been a lot of new power plants also, hydropower plants built after that. And now we're actually very green in that sense that over 70% of our energy produced in our country is based on hydro. And many entities has been participating in that development, especially the Nordic Investment Fund and other banks. So we are accustomed to that type of interest, and that's something that most entities around the world doesn't know.
Mm-hmm. So the framework for investment is there. What do each of you think is the most urgent infrastructure requirement that's needed right now in the Arctic?
I think it's urgent today, and I think it will continue to be urgent, and that the region itself continues to be a region of low tension. As the Foreign Minister of Norway, Jonas Gahr Støre, used to say, high north, low tension. For investment to occur, for the region to mature in terms of a sustainable strategy, it has to be peaceful. It has to be one without tension. And that urgency is an ongoing urgency.
Ambassador.
Well, since you mentioned that very important point, that allows me to mention another important point, which is, I think, for shipping really to go on in the Arctic, it needs to be safe. Mm-hmm. And I think we still need to do a lot of work on search and rescue and on sort of emergency preparedness response in terms of making Arctic shipping safe and then implement the Polar Code and all that, which is coming.
Yeah, very important. Sven?
Could you repeat?
The most important infrastructure development or platform that we need right now in the Arctic, the thing we have to do first.
Well, when you're looking at the Arctic as a whole area, mm-hmm. there has been put forward the element of harbor constructions as some of the most emerging ones. So I would like to underline that could be something to put forward, of course. But when we are looking at our own country and looking outwards, it's different, because we are not a part of that kind of infrastructure as it is now, mm-hmm. And that's why we are looking at our own needs per se, and that's the airport projects. We also have harbor projects that are the fundament for doing our own shipping routes more effective.
Okay, so we need to lay the groundwork with shipping and ports first of all. Is there enough financing, patient capital? Is there enough of that in the world to fund these projects, in your opinions?
Well, if there was, I wasn't sitting here and putting forward this issue. I think it's not a struggle, but it's not easy either. And I think this kind of forum and these kind of activities helps in that direction. Mm-hmm. And that's also why I participate in this forum, because we really want to put forward the agenda and to heighten the awareness of these issues.
Ambassador, what about indigenous populations? And Professor, I'd like you to take a stab at this as well. How difficult is it negotiating with these groups for the rights to go in, to explore, to build, so on and so forth? Is it a stumbling block, would you say?
I think the indigenous peoples are interested to collaborate. For example, in the Bering Strait region, we have indigenous communities on the U.S. side and on the Russian side that have challenges to communicate and share activities in that region. So the answer is, I think the indigenous communities are absolutely interested in participating. The Arctic Council gives them an unusual voice in terms of participation, equivalent to a state in a sense that they're at the table. Now the challenge is to make sure that their voice continues as other states become involved in the Arctic region.
And Ambassador, what's your view on that? Because I know some investors consider it a challenge. They think it's going to be much more difficult than the professor was making it sound to be.
Okay. Well, I think I'll start answering by saying that one important takeaway from this discussion that we've had is that it's not one Arctic. You know, realities differ, and certainly conditions for the Arctic peoples also differ. In my country, in Norway, the Arctic population is actively engaged and has been for as long as we can remember in economic activity. I think they see great opportunities lying ahead. They're also, by law and by our constitution, taking part in our decision processes. So this is not a problem at all. It's rather a resource, I would say. And then I realized in other parts of the Arctic region, I don't know so well, the need for consultation is different. But I think that is keenly appreciated by most actors in the Arctic, that these indigenous people, they have a say and they have important knowledge that we need to take into account.
Yes, it's certainly a vast region. Have there been any lessons from the past that we can apply to the future, things that haven't worked, for example, ineffective practices? Any takers?
I'll take a lesson.
Okay.
During the gold rush in Alaska, the people that made the money weren't the miners. They were the people that provided the services, the picks and the shovels and the axes and the other things that were the supplies. And the real opportunities in the Arctic are not necessarily the extractive industries, but the suppliers of the various activities.
Anyone else?
Well, I was a little, I would not say provoked by the statement that it can be a challenge to do business with the natives in the Arctic region.
I'm part native, by the way, so
I know. I
can throw that out there.
But I think the issue can be that people don't travel to the Arctic very often, so they are not in a position to sit in their New York office and quite understand how to balance the return of investment and the issues that we are arising, a fair participation, for example, or the sustainability issue, or what have you. So if you really want to tap into the possibilities in the Arctic, you have to come and visit. That's an issue that I would like to stress, because if you haven't been there and haven't discussed different issues with us in our own country, I think it would be difficult to understand why we are prioritizing the way that we are.
What about the fact that energy prices have been struggling for some time now with the advent of shale, extracting it from shale rocks, and prices have been down for quite some time? Does that affect the pace of development in the Arctic, since the oil companies don't have the money that they used to? Is that going to change the trajectory of development? Ambassador?
I'm not in the oil and gas industry, but certainly I understand from my friends in that industry that many projects that were planned for the Arctic is now on hold because of the low oil price. So that is certainly happening. I hope that competence that is involved in that industry won't go away, so that at a later stage maybe these projects will come on stream again. Let's see.
Sven, what are you hearing on the investment side?
Well, I think it's very difficult to foresee how the oil exploration development will go. I think most of us are waiting the oil companies to state when they actually will restart their efforts in exploring the areas. So that's difficult.
Paul.
In 2009, there was a report from the U.S. Geologic Survey that suggested that 30% of global oil and 13% of global gas was on the continental shelf. We see oil prices go up and down. We know that we as a civilization require energy. I think it's unrealistic to expect that it will always be in the current situation where current global prices are prohibitive to exploration in the Arctic. I think that will change. The opportunity is, and the challenge is to respond effectively with the infrastructure to make sure that we have in place the types of solutions that mitigate any type of accidents when, not if, but when the energy happens.
Okay. I'd like to throw it out to the audience now to see if there are any questions out here. If anyone has a question, we have one from this gentleman up here. We'll get a microphone to you.
Yeah, my company, we have been part of the design team for the extension of the Nuuk harbor in Greenland, and we are in very good contact with some of the, let's say, future players in the mining industry in Greenland. Those companies are from the US, from Australia, Canada. Mining in Greenland, that was the future of Greenland a few years ago, but now Greenland is not anymore on that radar. It seems to be under the radar, let's say. Part of, I've heard from those mining companies that part of the problem in Greenland is that the Greenland government is not willing to support the infrastructure, the harbor part of those projects. Do you see some possibilities for private companies, not in the mining business, coming into the harbor parts of those projects? And is the investment protocol perhaps the solution to that?
Sven.
Well, the investment protocol certainly helps in that direction. I think our government and the current regime is open for a dialogue in that respect. There has been a tendency that the government goes in solely and invests in those projects because no external entities has shown real interest in that regard. But now, for example, in regards to the coming airport projects, our finance minister has extended his openness towards external entities coming in and participate in those projects. So the openness is there. And just to comment also on a different issue that relates to that is that there's two different perspectives to this. There are the projects that are done from outside and placed in the Arctic region as an oil exploration project or something else, a mine or what have you. And then you have all the internal projects in the country being planned by Greenlandic companies or the Greenland government and seeking outwards for financing. That's two different kinds of perspectives, and I think we need to re-evaluate how you actually look at the Arctic region, because many of the bigger projects that are being discussed now is projects being done outside and placed in the Arctic region. But there's also a lot of projects in the Arctic region seeking the attendance of external finance, and those projects are also very sound.
So you work in government. Can we get my microphone, Foose, for a moment? Is it okay? My mic's not working. Testing. We'll just swap this one over. Thank you. I don't think this one's working either. Can you hear? Okay. Oh, here we go. Okay, we're okay now. We'll share one. Sven, you actually worked in government for a couple of years, and you left your investment position, and you were working in the government. Can you give anyone in the audience, can you give us some insight if you're an external company, you want to come in and you want to do business and develop projects in Greenland? Is there anything in particular that the government doesn't like that makes them pull back from a potential investor? Can you give us any insight on that?
I think I'll go back to some of the earlier statements that I made in regards to the investment protocol, because it really helps putting up a framework for a dialogue. And if you haven't done your research as an external company coming in with a project under your arm and present it to the government, and haven't really tapped into what kind of issues that we are focusing on, that might be a long process then. You have to be aware of the priorities that we have in regards to get a more speedy process, because the projects are there and the possibilities are there. We are welcoming external projects in our country at least. But many tend to, or some tend to approach it as they might approach other areas in the world, and we are not other areas in the world. We are the Arctic, and we are looking more long-term on certain issues, and of course sustainability is a very important issue for us.
All right, wonderful. Any other questions from the audience? We have, we have another one from this gentleman, follow-up question.
Indeed, it's not a question, it's a comment.
Okay, we'll take a comment.
According to my experience, it's worth for all of you to know, especially here from the south, that business in the Arctic area is a fair business. It's not corrupt. It's a very transparent and fair business. And that is very important for all of the investors to know. This is the issue in most of the Arctic countries. That means you can rely on us.
Thank you. Any other questions? We have one back here.
Yes, Paul Foose from Alaska. And, it seems like Arctic's in the news. There's a new conference. You could go to probably 3 or 4 a week. They've almost run out of names for them, which is great. The problem is that it's also creating us to be a target. And we're really concerned about that, the people who live there, that this whole idea that, well, we're going to leave all the oil in the ground, or everybody, leave all the oil in the Arctic. Why aren't we saying leave all the oil in Africa? The people that went against Shell Oil, their alternative, if they didn't have Arctic oil, which they're selling them, is oil sands tar from Canada and Nigeria. And so somehow that's better than Arctic development. So I think we have to be really careful of that. And for people, it also almost becomes like a fetish or a part of their imagination, the Arctic, without realizing it's actually a homeland for people. We actually live there. You've got people here from some of our native corporations that can remember in their lifetime, mothers, the child dying in their arms because there was no medical care. Send your kids far away to school where they didn't let you speak your language, or go out hunting on the ice, never come back because there was no search and rescue. Those were not the good old days. So I hope that people will remember that, and all of you can be allies to us. You'll find us very good partners, but we also have a right to live and have economic development like anybody else in the world.
Okay. Professor, would you like to weigh in on this?
Absolutely. The challenge, again, comes back to one's balance. It's not one or the other. It's not environmental protection or preservation of the indigenous peoples or economic prosperity. The challenge is balance. And all of these have to occur, will occur, should occur. And the opportunity is to think in ways that are inclusive, bringing in diverse stakeholders and perspectives to figure out what this roadmap looks like, which I guess is part of the objective behind the Arctic Investment Protocol, to create a roadmap, a phased process. What do the pillars look like in terms of this Arctic development? To be sustainable, we have solutions like an emergency response agreement for pollution. We have a search and rescue agreement. But they're fine agreements by themselves. In the absence of the infrastructure to implement them, they're hollow. The challenge is one of balance, and I agree with you 100%, Paul. Like Paul's the notion of economic development, prosperity is fundamental to the lives that we lead. But we also need clean air and clean water. We need to preserve the social balance and culture richness that exists in the Arctic, like elsewhere. So I would, as a word, I think the word is balance.
Ambassador.
If I should do like Paul and choose a word, I would say the word is inclusion a little bit. And the fact alone that we are in Singapore and so many different stakeholders interested in and discussing with such energy this region, I think is a sign that we need for legitimate and good governance in the Arctic an inclusive system that take into account many stakeholders, certainly the observers in the Arctic Council and many other forces that want to contribute and feel ownership and interest in the Arctic. That the people that call Arctic their home has all the rights they have. It's a given. Mm-hmm. That's not a question of inclusion. They're already there. But for the other governance, I think inclusion is key. And the good thing is that before development start in a really, really big way, we have a governance system in place. It's always more difficult when it's the other way around. And we have the Arctic Council, we have the law of the sea, we have regimes in place which, if we are clever, can be adapted to the changing Arctic.
So now that the investment protocol is in place, do you think it will be easier to further the development agenda of the Arctic? Will it be easier to put that message out there instead of having people just say, wait a second, this is a pristine part of the world, we need to be careful?
I agree. I think it reinforces important principles, and I think it also, like you said, it sends a message to investors that there is such a thing as an investment universe in the Arctic. I don't think everyone thought about that before.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions from the audience? We have one from this table here.
Yeah, me, Treadwell from Alaska. Can you tell me, how is Greenland going about financing infrastructure right now? Is it relying on Copenhagen and national financing means? Is there local, has the local government established a bonding capability, or are you looking for public-private investment in things like these airports? How are you going about it?
I think the main focus is public-private partnerships. The government has the means to finance them themselves, but they are very keen on opening up in regards to these projects. So the thing that will happen is that the government plans to put forward a tender on the projects to seek external partners to invite them in to start discussions on how to structure the financing on those, even though that they can finance them themselves. So there's it looks very, very interesting. And as I also said before, we have a lot of experience in dealing with external finance means on some of our infrastructure projects. As I said before, the hydropower projects, almost every one of them has been co-financed by external parties.
Any other questions from the floor? We have one from this gentleman over here. We'll get a microphone over to you.
Thank you. Commander Blake McBride, Office of Naval Research Global in Singapore. I have a question for Sven. I recently had a chance to deploy with the Danish Navy in Greenland. We pulled into Granadal. So much like Admiral Varison mentioned with the former U.S. naval station in Keflavik being used in innovative ways, sort of swords into plowshares kind of approach to the promise of the opening Arctic. And ADAC was mentioned as well. So is the well-preserved and now abandoned Granadal installation being considered as part of the plan you referred to earlier?
In regards to?
The
Danish military is planning to tear the whole area down. Mm-hmm. And that's a pity, I think. And many of our in our country is trying to put forward another agenda. Let's leave it and develop the area, hand it over to other parties to further develop the area and utilize the area for other means. But the Danish military is another conviction. So I think we have some issues there. They are going forward to tear all the buildings down and everything.
Professor.
Just an observation. Part of the strategy that was laid out included an inventory of infrastructure. Presumably these decommissioned hubs provide some potential that should be considered, like ADAC, like the one you just mentioned in Greenland. So perhaps there is urgency to identifying this inventory so that these decisions can be made thoughtfully before governments tear down facilities that ultimately may have some value.
Okay, sounds like room for collaboration there. Any other questions from the floor? We have time for one more. I believe we have one from this gentleman down here. Okay, no, he's saying no. Time for one more from the floor. Anyone on this side? All right, we've heard the bell to wrap this up. Twice. I want to do one thing before we finish. It's a series of quick-fire questions for each of the panelists up here on the stage, and they have 10 seconds or less to answer. And it's just a way to sort of sum up some of their broad views on what they're seeing in the Arctic. So question number one, we'll start with you, Ambassador. What is the biggest misconception about doing business in the Arctic?
How far apart the different regions are, how different they are.
Sven.
I think the biggest misconception is that it's very difficult to do business in the Arctic.
And clearly you don't think that's true. Professor?
Extractive industries are the reason for investment.
All right. Question number two, biggest opportunity in the Arctic?
Opportunities are vast, and I think a real good opportunity coming from a government perspective is if we can maintain an inclusive, stable, and predictable legal order in the Arctic. I think that's really a number one deliverable.
Nicely put. Sven?
Well, we have a tendency to look at normal infrastructure projects as the most obvious ones, but I think freshwater export to the rest of the world is a really big opportunity.
Okay. Professor?
I think the Arctic holds global promise in terms of revealing strategies to balance national interests and common interests.
All right. And finally, last question of the day is your boldest prediction about what lies ahead for the region.
A region that is giving better lives to everyone who's living there, a region that is also solving problems for the rest of the world, and a region that is peacefully governed in a new and innovative way.
Sven?
I think the issue about building up the Arctic as a big energy hub for the North American area is really interesting, and I think that's very capable for the near future as a big project.
Interesting. That is interesting. And Professor?
I think most important responsibility that every generation has is to offer hope and inspiration to future generations. So my hope is that the development of the Arctic is coordinated, cooperative, and consistent.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.